of 2 p.m, so I believe we should start. It reminds me of Bristol, where, of course, the Planning Inspectorate is based, and I think it's the Guildhall still has railway time and Bristol time, which is about 15 minutes later than railway time. So, just a few quick preliminaries and one matter that I'm conscious of that tided over from this morning's hearing. We do have some new faces in the room, however, so I'm conscious that I would like to do a brief set of introductions before we go much further. And can I also check, is this a venue that you're familiar with, or do I need to do the how to leave the building? You were here this morning. Been here many times. Okay, we can probably skip the fire drill and related activities. The arrangements then for this afternoon's hearings are set out in a combination of the programme and the agendas, which everybody should have. I'm proposing to break at 3:30 for afternoon tea for about 15 minutes. We're aiming to conclude by 5 p.m, hopefully a little earlier, maybe even this afternoon. Can I now just ask the Council to introduce themselves very briefly, and then we will introduce ourselves again on this side of the table. And my name, of course, is Ryn Smith, and I'm the Inspector appointed to examine the allocations plan document. So, for the Council.
Good afternoon. My name is Kelvin Hinton. I'm the Planning Policy Manager with the Borough Council.
Hello, I'm Sharon Evans, Senior Planning Officer within the Planning Policy team.
Good afternoon. It's Adrian Tofts, Planning Policy Team Leader at Tunbridge Wells Borough Council.
Good afternoon. I wasn't here this morning, but my name's Linda Middlemiss. I'm a Major Planning Projects Officer with the Council. I work within mainly dealing with planning applications, but it may be that I can be of some assistance. I know we're talking about principles, but if there are any detailed matters, I might be able to help.
Thank you very much and welcome. Now to the Civic Society again. Not sure your microphone is live, Mr. Whitbourne. Dr. Whitbourne, apologies.
Sorry. Dr. Philip Whitbourne, Royal Tunbridge Wells Civic Society.
Thank you very much.
Brian Lippard, Chairman, one of the co-chairmen of the Royal Tunbridge Wells Civic Society.
Thank you very much. And now Dandara Limited.
Rachel Oller, Planning Director at Dandara. We're owners of Union House and Knightswood.
Thank you very much. Now, I will briefly remark, obviously, everything that transpires this afternoon is being recorded digitally. Hopefully the microphones will behave for us. If they don't for some reason, then I'll just call a brief timeout whilst Council reset the system. Trust that you'll bear with me while that's done if necessary. But if this morning's process is anything to go by, everything should be working properly. Preliminary and procedural matters. Only very briefly to observe that in the morning session the Council were or did undertake to look at providing me with some figures in relation to the Civic Centre allocation site that we're sitting in now. Are those ready, and can they be circulated? Thank you very much for those, Ms Evans. Before I ask you to speak briefly to them, if I can just note for the programme officer, I'd like these to be brought into the examination library beside the matter A main issue 5 paper, so that when we look online, that's where we'll find it, and put a suffix like brackets A or something of that nature, so that it's easy to find. That's the most important one. This is God forbid we find that we have a document that's come in that doesn't end up in the library. And if I can just check with the council, if it hasn't already been emailed to Mrs. Duncan, then if it could be.
Yes, we will do that, sir. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay. Do you want to just briefly talk me through where we get to with these figures?
Yeah, as we discussed at the session this morning, we've come back with the detail. The overall site area of the ALRTW2A policy, which is the civic site, so it's the whole area of change site as shown on the proposals map. We have done some previous sort of initial feasibility work that looks at the mix of uses that are set out within that policy and how they might be achieved on the site. And as I've set out on this sheet that we've circulated around the table, it is an indicative estimate of uses which could be achieved. And so we've just got some sort of ballpark figures in there. I will sort of emphasise that the uses on there and the figures stated are figures which could possibly be delivered, and they do respect the key parameters of the site in terms of the historic setting and the heritage assets, which we're all very aware are evident on the site. So in terms of, we've just got some broad figures for B1 office of 2,000 square metres, A1, A3 type retail uses, and that does include a department store over 2 levels, which we've looked at and could be achieved to provide about 10,000 square metres, but with an overall figure of retail within the whole of the site at 22,000 square metres. We've got D1, D2 assembly and leisure at 5,000 square metres, and then we've got an element of residential use on there as well, approximately 30 to 40 units. And we've also got re-provided parking, because obviously we've got the existing multi-storey car park on that site.
Yeah.
And obviously we would need to be re-providing car parking at the same level or increased level.
Possibly more, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a kind of a broad indication of the types of uses that we think could be achieved on the site, acknowledging that it is a large site. There are a number of existing uses on there with the listed buildings, and obviously more detailed work needs to be carried out in terms of the master planning for that area. But
yeah. So to encapsulate where that takes us to and to inform the conversation that we were having with the Civic Society this morning, that's probably about 45% of the site that ends up potentially being retail in terms of the early stage feasibility work that you've had done, and roughly 55% falling into the basket of other uses. That's a picture that is somewhat different strategically from maybe the Civic Society's envisioning of a future use such as a university campus. It's not a picture that would enable the delivery of that type of use alongside the scale of retail that you're looking at. It's also a larger scale of retail, interestingly, than you're proposing in Table 6 on page 33 of the plan. So, what is there a particular source for these figures? Is there a document, a study that's been done, or is this internal work? Or
it's internal work that has been drawn up.
Right.
I think, obviously, as you pointed out, the retail figure in this is higher.
Yep.
It's in looking at feasibility schemes, you look at various options.
Oh, yeah.
We've looked at what options could be achieved, and that's why the figure in the policy is a more conservative figure than obviously what's based on some of this kind of work that we've carried out. So,
okay. So just exploring that again briefly, could this be described as a kind of retail max model, whereas maybe the figure in the draft plan is a kind of retail real model or a retail conservative model.
Yeah, I think, and it's reflecting the uses that we'd like to see achieved on the site as well.
Okay. Right. So unless the council want to add anything further to that, what I'll now do is move to the Civic Society and just allow them to make some concluding remarks following the train of thought that they were in before we reached this point, which should then enable us to resolve what the point of difference is still between the council and the Civic Society, because I suspect there will still be a point of difference. Civic Society.
Thank you. I'd really start with a question of clarification on here, because the A1A3 says 22,000 square metres, and as you pointed out, the document is 15,000. But there is a difference already. There is retail on the site. Now, is that 7,000? Is that the difference? How much is there at the moment?
That's a very, very good point. Thank you.
So before we go any further, I'd like clarification on that, please.
The figure stated in the sheet I've circulated is gross additional floor space.
Gross additional floor space.
Circulated as gross additional floor space.
Gross additional floor space.
My initial comment after that.
Just one moment, because I've got a clarification on the clarification, I'm afraid. If we then look at Monson Road and Calverley Road, where from memory from my site inspection there are existing retail frontages within ALRTW2A, so the tail end, the eastern end around the curve of Monson Road, and there's a little street, the name of which I'm unaware of, that essentially is almost like a straight continuation of a section of Monson Road by the bend. There's a retail frontage there, and then I recall a retail frontage on Calverley Road, from the crossroads essentially up to Crescent Road. Yeah. Just to be clear, none of that existing retail floor space is included within this figure. No. But clearly, if we then were to go back to the policy itself, ALRTW2A, you're referring to at least 15,000 square metres net additional comparison retail floor space. So it may be the case that while some of that existing retail floor space might be redeveloped pursuant to the policy, you would seek addition and replacement. Yeah, no, that's fully understood. Civic Society, are you now clear? I think I'm clear.
Yes, thank you for the clarification. I think I would just reiterate your point, sir, about the possibility of a university campus on the site, as to what extent that should be considered in a revised plan. So would that reduce the amount of retail, for instance? Because there would appear to be quite distinct, different ways this could go, and you can't mix and match. You've got one or essentially another.
Okay. Well, I will return to the council. Yes, by all means.
So part of my difficulty is that I'm not clear what comprises a university campus in the eyes of the civic society, what exactly this creature of development is, and therefore how big or small it might be, what form it would take in terms of layout, uses, etc. The point of producing these figures as requested, as we saw it, was to demonstrate that if you seek to push the retail provision to its absolute extreme, we believe, particularly through the inclusion of a department store on 2 levels, that you can achieve those levels of additional retail floor space that we set out in the table without compromising the heritage assets of the site, and indeed not necessarily requiring this town hall building as part of the overall complex to be changed to retail. These figures really envisage the key retail additional floor space being provided on the eastern part of the site, which is less constrained in terms of heritage assets to the remainder of the site fronting Civic Way.
With regard to the university, I'm thinking the leader of the council is the person who has mentioned this. I suspect are as much in the dark as you are, sir, on that. We have no detail as to size. There's an implication potentially that it might start small, but would then the council be very pleased if it expanded and we became something, if not a full university town, then something that was approaching it. And I'll put in at this juncture, the Civic Society certainly not against that idea, and having a university population within the town, certainly not against that idea, and having a university population within the town is worth very serious consideration.
I think at that juncture what I'm going to do is suggest that if we have some consideration at some strategic level within the authority, consideration of this sort of proposal, I mean, if it does emanate from, say, the leader of the council, but it hasn't yet found expression in the plan, and it may be that it won't do at this juncture because it's not policy in any sense, or it's a germ of an idea that's been spoken of politically but hasn't been taken a great deal further. Essentially what I need to work out is how much of a realistic proposition is available. Have we crossed that sometimes very nebulous threshold between something that is an all-round good idea and something that is sufficiently concrete and realistic and achievable that it actually needs to be provided for in an allocation local plan? And I have to be guided by the council on this, and I think the council, if this is an idea that's come from the leader, I think the council need to go back and check how far it's gone and whether they are expected to include it and indeed authorised to include it in a draft policy, or whether it's something that, say, for example, might end up being picked up in the local plan review process. Now, if it ends up being the latter, given the nature of the discussions that we've had here, what I will need to do is essentially consider how future-proof the existing policy framework is and whether that does anything that could seriously inhibit future policy options, or whether in fact it's capable of remaining in situ because other things could be done.
If I may say so, sir, I think you make an excellent point. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can I leave that then as an action on the council? Could you possibly...
If I could just make one comment, well, a couple of comments at this stage. The first point would be that, is a simple point, is that the policy as worded provides for educational provision within the mix of uses in any case. So it's certainly not excluded, and the policy is flexible enough to provide for that nature of use in some form or the other. That's the first point. Second point is a more general one, is that the council has an aspiration in terms of attracting a university presence to the town or to the borough generally, and is not solely directed to this site.
Oh, right.
And you will understand, sir, that the discussions can take many forms and are subject to the usual confidentialities and sensitivities. And I think we need to bear that in mind as well.
Do I take it from that, Mr. Hinton, that you are sufficiently confident of the position in relation to the development of this idea that you don't need to check with the leader's office or anybody else? Or alternatively, that you need to check and come back to me?
In order not to mislead anybody, I will double check and confirm one way or the other back to you, sir.
Thank you. Would tomorrow be a good time for that to be done? Okay. Well, you don't agree with each other. I don't think you're going to agree with each other. And again, this one will have to rest in the umpire's basket, and I'll have to consider it with great care. But before I leave it, I'll just return briefly to the Civic Society and see if my characterisation of where we're at is correct.
Yeah, I personally wouldn't want to characterise it as a disagreement. I really would welcome an interchange and working towards a solution, because I readily accept that the university thing is at a very early stage, and so the council quite rightly point out that the development might be on other sites. So it's not a disagreement. I think it's a healthy discussion.
Indeed. Can we therefore draw this morning's matters to a close? If we then move to matter B, main issue 1. There is of necessity some overlap between the discussions that we've been having this morning and this matter, because the overarching theme that applies to all of today's conversations, which is why I decided to hold them today in one hit, is essentially the tension between the levels of precision that you have in policies that are seeking to bring about urban change, if you want to make sure that urban change happens in the right place, at the right time, and to deliver outcomes that are strategically supported by the council, as against the flexibility that's necessary to allow market-responsive outcomes to occur. And that's a tension that seems to be emerging from, it emerged from a number of the original submissions to the plan. it's a tension that's still been apparent from the written responses to questions and the written statements that parties have made. So, with that opening remark in mind, what I think we need to do again is to move around the room, hear the summarised in principle positions of the relevant parties. I will introduce 42 Leisure and Dandara first, just to provide a changing of the guard, so to speak, and then I'll come to the Civic Society, and then I'll come to the Council for a response. So, 42 Leisure.
Thank you, sir. I think from the standpoint of the issues that have been discussed this morning, we are of the view that by nature the plan should have an element of flexibility within it to respond to the MPPF and National Planning Policy guidance. It does also, though, need to have some degree of certainty with regards to deliverability moving forward. So we are of the view that there's enough detail within the plan, subject to the taking forward the master planning approach, which is proposed in the document. We are mainly concerned about the potential impacts of piecemeal approaches to development, particularly in the areas of change, and the fact that that may not deliver the vision and the aspirations of the plan. We're mindful of the fact that the master planning approach has been consistently promoted by the Council over a number of years now, in the face of representations that have been made to revert to individual site allocations within those areas. Our view is that the master planning approach is important. It doesn't have to delay the process of development, that it can in fact assist it by ensuring that there is a consistency and a coordination of approach. Our view, however, is that maybe there does need to be a bit more clarity with regards to how the master planning process is undertaken. We're aware there's a slight change in the nuance of the policy wording from the draft submission, which talked about the council working with local businesses, landowners, developers to produce a master plan document, to developers in cooperation with the Borough Council to produce the master plan document. And we are of a view that the council has an important role as a facilitator in the process to bring the parties together, to produce a framework for planning applications to come forward without being too prescriptive or stifling individual creativity that might come forward in those applications, but really establishing some of the key strategic principles which are set out in the DPD but don't have a spatial form at the present time. So that's really our position, which is, yes, keep some flexibility within the plan with certainty, but to really ensure that the master planning process is taken forward and that the council does act as a facilitator in that process.
Now, just testing that position, I mean, you're essentially asking for a clearer commitment on the face of the policy that the council will act as ringmaster. Can I just ask, I mean, your underlying concern, I take it, is that if that commitment isn't there, then the coordination has to be done by a range of different developer interests, some of whom will have very different views as to outcome and timing than others. Therefore, you may end up with either no agreement or a partial agreement or an untimely one. Is that...
That's correct. I think it's implicit in the role of the council in any event, in strategic development and in taking forward plans to take that role. I think it's just in terms of the wording, it's the shift in the wording which rather, it appears to move the responsibility away from the council in taking that role. But I think the council does have a role in doing that, and actually I've just come from a process with another authority where the council has taken that role in being very proactive and front-ending the planning process to bring the parties together, even in advance of the local plan hearing, to do that. So it doesn't mean, and I think the council has already demonstrated through producing the urban design framework that it has done a certain amount of feasibility work and assessment, and as you just said in relation to the civic centre site, that the council has looked at these areas. I don't believe for 1 minute they'd have actually produced the plan as they have, with the areas of change identified of allocations, without having undertaken a certain degree of work in that, in looking at the feasibility of bringing those proposals forward. So I think it's not a new role for the council. It's an implicit role in the council's function to take that role, and in the spirit of proactive planning, that was what we would expect the council to do. And you want it explicit, and you want it. I think it just in terms of the wording, we would prefer to revert to the wording that was in the original draft plan, to make that quite clear. Okay. Obviously, the council will have its opportunity to wrap up in response to all of the points made, but I would like to hear a specific response to that point. Is there anything else that you want to bring out before I move on to Dandara? No, I think it's covered in my statement. Indeed. But I think it's an important point I would reiterate is that we don't think the master planning approach shouldn't be a process that inhibits or delays development moving forward. We want to be quite clear on that. We're not suggesting that the council reverts into a long process of further plan preparation. It may be that the use of the term master plan is a bit misleading in the sense we're not looking at the council in any way to produce a detailed master plan. No. It's framework. Might be a strategic master plan framework or something of that sort that we're talking about. Because most of that work will still rest to be done within individual planning applications as it comes forward. Yeah. But it's a consistent framework to work within, which we think is very important, particularly for a town like Tunbridge Wells, for all the reasons that the Civic Society set out this morning in terms of its importance and the need to take a comprehensive approach to its future. And again, I'm taking it that it, in your view, is an effective means of responding to individual allocations that are in multiple ownerships, where a measure of coordination, in your view, is... None of these sites are simple, and I think when we look around the town and sees the progress of key sites, they have been hampered by a number of key constraints. And this is, I think, a way of actually trying to address some of those constraints. Okay. Now that's one view. And then Dandara, let's hear your position.
Hi, we don't necessarily have an issue with the approach in the policy generally. What we do have an issue with is the wording in the policy, and it is specific to the area of change policy because that's where our land interest is. Indeed. We're not suggesting that a master plan approach is not appropriate on some of the other sites. There are some site-specific issues to do with the area of change, which I think calls into question master plan, which is something that we've put in our representations, and I know we've got further hearing sessions on site-specific issues. It is effectively just the wording, I think, of the policy that we're here today to discuss, and the status of what this master plan is, who takes control of it, what the scope and the status of a master plan is. I think in particular the area of change is a relatively small area. 42 letter just referenced the need to set a framework. I think the policy wording of that area of change does set a framework. It sets out clear aspirations for that area of change. What's perhaps missing in terms of a master plan is some sort of strategic drawing to go with it. I'm personally not of the view that that's necessary to deliver what the policy needs to deliver. In particular, there is a bit of a conflict, I think, between what's in the submission draft at 3.35 and the policy. The policy wording talks about a master plan shall be prepared in cooperation with obviously various groups and shall look at the policy aspirations and how that they will be delivered specifically. At 3.35, it then goes on to say it is acknowledged that some buildings and sites may not come forward in advance of a comprehensive master plan. However, any proposal should not compromise the comprehensive redevelopment of each area of change or the wider core strategy objectives. If a master plan does not include all the area covered by an area of change policy, then it will need to demonstrate that the overall aims of the policy are not compromised by proposals for development as part of the policy area. We have absolutely no issue with that approach. That is exactly the approach that we support, and all we want is for that position to be reflected within the actual policy wording.
Okay. Now, again, I don't want to trespass too much into the sort of site specifics that we're going to deal with in December. The reason I wanted to hear from both of you today alongside the Civic Society. Okay, yeah. Well, this is an issue that I want to test with you before we go much further. What I did want to do was hear from both of you today and the Civic Society, so that I could be clear about whether or not there were any generic or in principle concerns with master planning approaches per se that were meaning that I was being recommended to somehow address the in principle approach to policy drafting that's been taken. Now, what I'm hearing from you today is at the moment you're not saying that.
What we're saying is,
but you've got a very site-specific issue.
We do have site-specific issues, yes. So we're not suggesting that a master plan approach shouldn't take place on the civic centre, on the cinema site, or whichever of the sites, because I don't think it's for us to comment on those. We don't know the specifics of those sites. What we are saying is the preparation of a master plan, as worded in the current policy, creates some concerns to us in the status of this master plan, how it's prepared, the timescales, deliverability, where planning applications sit alongside that. The council taking the lead on master planning is something that I think would be a really big agenda for them. There's a lot of areas of change, there's a lot of mixed-use allocations. That's a big resource to put on the council and bring together. And I think if that's an approach that is going to be taken on specific sites, that really needs to be considered in full. So that's one of the things. But I think that 3.35 does talk about demonstrating how proposals don't compromise development on any other part of the area of change, and that's something that we're perfectly comfortable with and is perfectly reasonable expectation. I just don't think that necessarily comes through in the policy wording, where it suggests a master plan shall be prepared in cooperation with various groups who may not wish to cooperate, may wish to have different aspirations. We have seen a master plan that Fortitude Leisure have given us for the area of change, which is not something necessarily we would be looking at to deliver for various reasons. It encompasses an area that's greater than the area of change. It's got deliverability issues to it. So I think the wording in the policy is quite a tall order, really, but we're not saying something shouldn't be prepared to show how the area of change can be delivered.
Okay. Anything further to add?
The only thing on timescales is that we are looking at bringing forward our asset in the next sort of few months, by spring next year.
Okay.
So to say that it doesn't impact our asset in the next sort of few months, by spring next year.
Okay.
So to say that it doesn't impact on deliverability, I don't think would be the case, because we are in a position where we've got permitted development rights for our asset that we could implement, and we're also looking at putting a separate redevelopment scheme through. I think these are material considerations that come into site-specific issues that we will discuss later.
They do. And again, in that respect, I will just flag more to agenda set for December than expect the council to address it now, but I think it's fair to make the observation now, because I did walk that site as part of my site inspections, and one of the things that struck me about it was that it was somewhat different to the generality of the other major town centre sites. The reason essentially being, in shorthand, that it seems to straddle in many ways the boundary of what might otherwise be referred to as the central business district of the town, and that it includes land in relatively high density existing use and development, such as Union House, and it also includes Montacute Gardens in what appear to be a mixture of probably private rental housing usage with multi-occupied, large, maybe late Regency villas. And it certainly struck me as in principle in terms of land assembly, design, relationships with nearby historic buildings, that it's a problematic site in a way that some of the others aren't. Now, we're not going to cure those issues today because they are agenda items for December, but I thought it was well worth getting onto the table the fact that something might need to be thought about that particular site that is maybe slightly different in approach to the general policy model that's being pursued elsewhere.
And I think that is part of our concern because it is a complicated site. I mean, we've obviously got our own landholder, which is complicated enough, but beyond that in the area of change there are other complications. There's the village green designation, which I think is very significant, which will impact.
That one has completely passed me by.
Yeah, it completely passes a lot of people. But I mean, that essentially removes quite a chunk of the area of change, that's our car parks. They're actually designated as village green, so that has an impact as well. Conservation area status. I think there's a lot of issues that need to be considered for this area that shouldn't necessarily prevent individual applications going forward.
Okay. Again, if I could ask the council to take a note at this point that I hadn't picked up on a village green designation having been made over past that site. It is relevant potentially to deliverability because it could, potentially affect the scale of the site and availability of land.
To just add, sorry, so not to be misleading, it is on the external car parking areas.
External car
which
parking.
Obviously there's a policy aspiration to protect the public parking anyway, so those kind of sit together, the need to protect the public parking on the village green.
Okay.
Sit together.
Now, 42 Leisure have a point.
I just add, I just think it just, I know that the issues will be discussed in much further detail at the next hearing, but I think it does highlight the difficulties and the complexities and the importance of the comprehensive approach, whether it be in a slightly different format, and they do raise different issues to the other areas of change, but the boundary was drawn for a reason, and I think that this is highlighting that particular reason, and also the need to look at areas of change don't necessarily mean development, but clearly the arrangement of the car parking at the moment, which is cut and severed by the right of access to Montacute Gardens, is a difficulty, and I don't think if we're really planning for the future, it's one that we necessarily want to leave as it is.
Okay. Those points being noted and the ones of detail for individual site consideration being essentially put on the conveyor belt that will lead to December. The issues of principle, I think, are now out. Can I then ask the Civic Society for, again, their in-principle position?
Thank you, sir.
Areas of change?
My colleague will deal with the master plan aspect of it. I suspect I'm just regurgitating what came up yesterday in my comments, where my concern with the overall document is the lack of the town centre area action plan, and the fact that the plan's bottom up rather than top down. And I used the example yesterday of hotels. And yesterday afternoon I found that one of the sites, namely the Dandara one, specifically will not have a hotel. So I think there, in fact, you pointed out another one. So there were 5 sites that had the potential for a hotel, because you added in the Sturge one, which I missed. So already now we're down to 4 possibilities, because Dandara specifically say there won't be one. And we have the potential now for another site going without a hotel, another one, and we'll end up with none. And for instance, on Sunday when I spoke to 2 of the senior councillors, and I just mentioned about hotels, I got a most emphatic, we need them. And So I really feel that the council need to have that specification in there that says our overall policy is that we want X hotel beds or just an indication that we actually want that. The similar thing then about conference centres. Are we really going for them or aren't we? If as a town we're going to market ourselves for that, then perhaps we do. But perhaps we've decided, in fact, the Spa Hotel or the Wellington, the whole range of places that we don't need anymore. So that's my concern there, that the document, I think, fails because it doesn't indicate a need for various types of development. I'll then defer to my to Dr. Whitbourne for about the master plan issue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. There is, of course, this dilemma that you've already identified and that flows through all these discussions of having enough flexibility not to rule out desirable things that might come up after the plan, and yet to be sufficiently clear in what can or couldn't happen, that you don't end up with something that isn't planning at all and just do what you like, chaps. I think this is a difficult balance to strike. On the matter of master plans, we, between us, the Civic Society and the Town Forum, had a little working group to get our heads round this site allocations document. The Town Forum, in case no one has previously explained, is a body that exists dealing with Royal Tunbridge Wells alongside the Civic Society. The town of Royal Tunbridge Wells, although it's in population terms nearly half the borough, is the only bit of the borough of Tunbridge Wells, not Royal, that doesn't have a town or a parish council. All the villages and the other smaller towns, Southborough, Cranbrook and Paddock, would all have town councils. Tunbridge Wells doesn't. So the council, in its wisdom, set up a thing called the Town Forum that consists of representatives of residents' associations and kindred bodies like the Civic Society, and the ward councillors for the unparished part of the borough. Anyway, so the Town Forum and the Civic Society both sat down to ponder, in particular, this paragraph that we're talking about of 335 and the wording of it and the concept of master plans. The problem partly flows, as Brian Lippard has already indicated, from the council's decision not to have the town centre area action plan that was promised in the core strategy, and that would have provided, one hopes, a context into which all these things, the RVP, the cinema site and the Union House and the Town Hall and the other things that are going on, could have fitted into this overall vision for the future of Tunbridge Wells. We don't have that. What we do have instead are the concept of master plans on the various areas of change. And we were bothered about the idea of master plans being handed over to developers to do instead of having the publicly produced overall town centre area action plan. The best wording that we could come up with, there may be better ones, is enshrined in the submission that it came in actually under the name of the Town Forum rather than the Civic Society, but we were all pondering the same matter. The wording at the moment is on page 36 of the site allocations document under paragraph 335. And what we were suggesting instead, it may be that there are better suggestions, is as follows. For each of the 4 areas of change, and we may come back to that, it may be that this should only apply to 3, or maybe the December meeting should decide that the areage road area of change isn't rightly defined. Anyway, for the relevant areas of change at any rate, an indicative development scheme is to be prepared by the potential developments through early, close and continuing collaborative work with developers, businesses, the local community, including the town forum, the borough council. And then the council may decide to adopt such a scheme as a master plan, if it is thought suitable, or alternatively, they may actually decide to adopt some other master plan or to produce one itself. But the adopted master plan, through whichever of those procedures, will then guide the development proposals for the area concerned. I don't suggest that wording can't be improved in some way, but that was what our little group felt was the best we could do with a circumstance that we didn't like through the loss of the town centre area action plan and the handing over, which we were very uneasy about, of master planning to developers who may have a different motive from the public interest.
So just to be clear, you're asking for a greater level of specification around process, the who and the how, and you want appearing on the face of policy where there are references to a master plan, essentially almost a safety net. Yes. That it's much clearer that it remains in the final decision-making discretion of the borough council to act in the community's interests and say, this is the plan, or alternatively, no, we've looked at this draft plan, we do not like it for reasons, and we're telling you to go away and produce another one to address these criteria, broadly those set out in the policy.
Or we'll do one ourselves.
Or alternatively, that they can do one themselves. Well, again, the principle of the acceptability of that is, I'm sure, something that the council themselves can respond to in their response to everything that they've heard from this side of the table this afternoon. Is there anything else that needs to be put now to get to the bottom of the Civic Society's position? Okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's earlier than I would have proposed to take a break. We've got 2 choices. We can either press right ahead and allow the council to swing into their response. And if I do that, I won't particularly want to interrupt them halfway through and have them lose their train of thought and flow. Or alternatively, we can break for 15 minutes now, come back at 3:05, and then the council have got free rein. I'm in your hands. What would you rather do?
I think, sir, on reflection, we'll take the break and come back.
Okay. Let us break now. We'll come back at 3:05, and then the council will complete their response on this matter. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Just before we leave the room, our desks and resume the hearing of matter B, main issue 1, by asking for the council's response to the matters that have been raised by representatives earlier on this afternoon.
Thank you, sir. I believe I can make sort of three short points, really, that pick up on some of the principles that have been mentioned in the discussion. First point is to say that obviously the council recognises that it has a key and leading role as the local planning.
Excuse me, Mr. Hinton. Can we just have phones switched to silent, please? Thank you very much. Apologies, Mr. Hinton.
That's okay, thank you. Yes, the council obviously recognises that it has a leading role as the local planning authority in leading in finding a solution to these sites and delivering the right development on the ground. And within that, we clearly support a collaborative approach of all the partners and stakeholders involved, and that is something that we would seek to champion in our role as the local planning authority. Third, and equally, we have promoted a master plan approach in the plan and the wording that we've used, but I think everybody will recognise that master plans come in many shapes and forms, appropriate to different circumstances and different sites and proposals, etc. So we're supportive of all those things. We believe, obviously, in presenting the plan, that the wording and the allocations strike the right balances between the various aspirations of the people that have spoken. And I think all we can do is reflect on the further comments that have been made regarding the possibility of further adjustments to the wording, either in the policy or in the explanatory text. Possibly liaise with some of the parties between now and when we return to the hearings in December, where we'll be looking at the individual sites. So we won't just rest with where we got to. We will have another look at it and see what further modifications we might be able to bring forward, and to what level of agreement we can reach in advance of those hearings with the various parties.
Thank you very much. I mean, again, in terms of the timescale for those conversations, we got a kind of useful arrangement suggested by yourself, Mr. Hinton, this morning, whereby the 26th of this month, which is the deadline for written statements for the December hearings, becomes the drop-dead date by which any further negotiations need to have been concluded to enable the submission of documents that express the degree to which agreement has been reached. And I think that would be a perfectly fine arrangement for this matter as well. And again, if I could just reflect on that which I've heard from this side of the table, and ask the council to turn their minds particularly to, I guess, the default setting or the safety net position in relation to the preparation of a master plan. I mean, yes, plans come in all shapes and sizes. There may be some circumstances where developers will immediately own plan preparation, progress it to timescales that you view as adequate, and also be very collaborative and engage with relevant community members and stakeholders productively. However, some sense in the policy, I think, of how to deliver in circumstances where that best practice model maybe doesn't happen for reasons might be useful, and in terms of ensuring deliverability isn't subject to blockage merely because a plan hasn't been brought forward by the parties that you'd hoped would bring it forward, again would help to provide a greater emphasis on deliverability than I think there is within the forms of words that are in the master plan sections of the relevant policies at present. I mean, it is a delicate matter, but I did also want not to leave this afternoon without having placed on the table as well the question of the council's appetite for another aspect of default settings or I guess delivery guarantee in relation to some of these, which is to ask the question of how far is the council itself prepared to go to use its own agency and its statutory powers to deliver land assembly, for example, should sites not be being brought forward, or should there be an individual landowner, say, for example, holding a ransom strip. I mean, we've all seen these sorts of issues occur in large urban developments previously. Are there circumstances in which the council would see it as necessary to ensure delivery that more is done than is maybe apparent would be done on the face of these policies? And if so, does that need to be said?
In part, so I think we would have to reflect on that. However, I think in principle, given what I've said about the council recognising its leading role as local planning authority, and being aware that in today's world, that is a role which councils are increasingly having to take in order to deliver development, whether that is because they actually have land ownerships themselves, for instance, which are in the mix of things, and that they have a key interest there in ensuring things happen, or whether, for instance, it's a question of using compulsory purchase powers in order to make sure that, again, things happen on the ground in the right place. So I think the culture of the organisation of the council is that, in principle, we would do whatever we felt was necessary and within our power to deliver the right development within the borough, and particularly within Royal Tunbridge Wells town.
Okay. Well, if all of that is then kind of wrapped up in the material that you put forward on the 26th, that will be very helpful. Now, turning to the kind of drift into specifics that we had on the Dandara site, and very much in the preparation of the council's written statement for the Royal Tunbridge Wells individual policies, again, because we've had this reference to a village green designation, I'd like chapter and verse on that, if possible, in council's written statement for that site. And also, given the observations that I've made in my site visit there, which is that it is a somewhat different site to the others, the latest position in terms of the pattern of land ownership and the state of play in conversations between the council and individual landowners about their willingness to participate, in inverted commas, in the delivery of the development outcomes envisioned in the policy.
That's fine, so we can do all of that.
Okay. Now, just let me briefly review my agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, I think realistically we have done what we need to do, because what I needed to get was a sense of whether there were any writ large disputes of principle still around in relation to the proposed master plan related policies. That's a matter that's now been thoroughly explored. I don't think we can go a great deal further until we get into the specific detail of individual policies, settlement by settlement, when we come back to do Royal Tunbridge Wells Town Centre in December. Hopefully that was useful from the standpoint of the organisations that participated. It's certainly been helpful to me, so I would like to thank you, very different organisations representing very different interests. I'd like to thank you very, very much for your participation today. It's helped me a lot. And also thank the council for their involvement. Before I bring today then to a close, I just want to remind anybody who might be attending tomorrow that we are moving house now. So we need to shift from this room to wherever the council needs us to be in order to move into the council chamber tomorrow morning. I gather that the robing room, which I'm using as a retiring room, is available to store documents overnight, so we don't literally have to take everything away. In the morning, we have a 9:30 start. Now, my understanding was that came about because there's actually an event in the council chamber that means we need to leave the council chamber by, is it 4 p.m?
We can check that, but I think there was an evening meeting and there needs to be time to set up for it. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, clearly we've got to start at 9:30 because that's the published time for start, and we will. But what that does mean in terms of the practicalities is that we've been in the habit of arriving at 8:30 in the morning. We need to arrive at 8 and gain access to the building at 8 if at all possible, because we've got to be able to set up the venue and make sure it's fit for the public no later than 9 a.m.
I'll be attending the evening meeting, so you're quite happy to carry on till 5:30, even 6 o'clock. All right? Just to disappoint you.
Well, we'll endeavour not to do so, but, you know, we will be as well behaved as we can. Boring practicalities, is that going to be feasible, and will somebody be on hand tomorrow morning to take the phone call?
Yeah, we'll be on hand outside at 8 o'clock. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Is there anything else that we need to sort out as a preliminary to tomorrow's business? No. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.